All right, hello everybody, welcome back. This is part 5, your final edition of your week 1 content. So, where we left off was in part 4 looking at eugenics. So, again, some really scary stuff that, again, we need to know about because essentially these are the kinds of things that community psychology was reacting to, right? We were saying that, we want to make sure that people live in a fair, free, equitable society. And so, what again we looked at was civil rights movement, the emergence of community psychology, things like that that were happening in the 1960s and 70s. One of the things that was really important in the development of community psychology was this book that was written in 1971 by a fellow named William Ryan. And the book was called Blaming the Victim. Now, this was a concept that essentially challenged everything that we just talked about with that eugenics movement stuff, right? The principles of eugenics. Eugenics blamed people, right? The eugenics movement said that if you were poor, if you didn't have education, if you had an addiction, etc., that it was your fault. But blaming the victim was essentially saying, we need to stop blaming the victim, right? We need to start looking at social issues like poverty, crime, addiction, education, unemployment, mental health, etc., not as deficits of the individual, but as things that can be caused in microsystems or organizations or localities or macrosystems. And yeah, sometimes people can do more as individuals to rectify their circumstances, right? Maybe a person didn't do as much job training as he or she could have, and that maybe led to their unemployed status, which led to their status of then being in poverty, which then impacted, their housing situation. They no longer could afford their house, for example. Fine, right? We do know that our individual choices and opportunities are important, but what if, again, you come from a family that couldn't afford to send you to school, couldn't afford to send you to university or college? How does that impact your opportunities? What if you didn't qualify for student loans, for example? What if you come from a community, for example, I come from a small town up north. I had to leave my family to go to university in the big city, right? I did not have the same kinds of family supports as I would have if my family lived in the locality where my university was. I had to, pay rent. I had to pay for all my groceries, stuff like that, right? And if I was living under mom and dad's roof, I would not have, had the same kind of financial issues that I did with my undergrad, right? The stereotype of the poor student. So these kinds of things really do impact people's opportunities and their lives. And William Ryan in 1971, he critiqued that individualist approach to thinking about social problems. He critiqued those folks who were from the eugenics movement who said that, yeah, if you are poor, it's your fault. He said, no, not necessarily, right? He said, well, what if this is a person who comes from a poor family? And I think the place where we can all kind of agree to meet on is kids, right? I think, regardless of your political orientation or your beliefs in this area, that we can all probably agree that no kid deserves to live in poverty, that all kids deserve education opportunities, that they deserve to live in a safe, clean, environment where they have access to good food and all of that good stuff, right? And that if a child doesn't have access to those things, that's not their fault, for goodness sakes, right? So William Ryan brought about this issue of blaming the victim that victims of these circumstances are not necessarily always responsible for the situation that they have ended up in. And this is a big part of what impacted or informed our thinking in community psychology. Now, earlier you heard me refer to top-down, bottom-up approaches. These are two ways that we think about how to help people in community psychology. So, a bottom-up approach is your traditional kind of grassroots activist approach to dealing with a social problem. So good examples are a self-help group, a neighborhood association. These are people who get together and say, we have a problem with X in our neighborhood. What are we going to do about it? Maybe we're going to approach town council, for example, to see if we can, get a bylaw passed or something like that, right? That would be a bottom-up approach. We also have a top-down approach, which would come kind of from above, from a professional or community leader, like municipal government, for example. Professional mental health care, something that comes from government initiatives like the pharmacare example that I talked about that Ontario is putting forth in the next budget. Now, neither approach, bottom up or top down, is always the best. Sometimes we need to kind of approach a social issue from two different angles, but essentially these are two ways that we go about making change in a community. Now, in community psychology, we love to argue with each other. We love to engage in what Julian Rappaport in 1981 called divergent reasoning. And he's got this great quote here: when everybody agrees with you, when everyone agrees with you, worry, right? When we're all kind of speaking the same language, if no one's bringing up multiple perspectives or diverse perspectives, maybe we need to start re-examining the issue. Basically, this is about celebrating our diversity, recognizing that conflicting viewpoints can coexist, and we need to embrace complexity when we are trying to deal with social issues, like big social issues like poverty or mental illness, for example. So divergent reasoning is a big part of our history in community psychology. Now, what the heck do community psychologists do? Well, you're looking at one, and you're looking at one thing she's doing. One thing we do is teach, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. A big thing that community psychologists do is prevention work. So we can work in substance abuse prevention. There are a lot of really cool programs that help people prevent school dropouts. We try to prevent things like teen pregnancy, domestic violence, the spread of HIV, homelessness. That's a big one that you hear me talking about. Bullying is a big topic right now in our society that's getting a lot of airtime in the media because it's a huge social issue at the moment. So that's a big area that community psychologists are working on preventing. One of the discussions that you're going to do for me in this program, or in this course rather, is about an anti-bullying program that has done very, very well. So we'll get to that in a little bit. We also look at, of course, preventing mental illness. How do we prevent people from experiencing psychological issues? We do health promotion and human development. Now, these are some examples of some of the different program areas that we might get into in community psychology. Head Start is a program that started a few decades ago. Basically what this is it's a program for kids, and if we say, if we can help you get a good start in life, if we can help make sure that you get a good education, that you've got good food, to eat good nutritious food, right? All of this good stuff, that we see that down the road, decades down the road, that you are more likely to be a more successful individual. And there's some great research out of Waterloo that has studied Head Start longitudinally, and we'll talk a little bit more about long-term studies next week when we get into chapters 3 and 4 on research. But long-term studies have a lot of power to be able to say that a program really works. And Head Start is a program that runs in Canada, that runs locally, that really works. looking at healthy diet, positive youth development, positive parenting, teaching conflict resolution in the family, all of these things. Community psychologists do empowerment. We try to do some community organizing. Again, whether there's a social issue that needs to be addressed, we might, rally a community together to address this issue through something like citizen participation. Maybe we advocate for a community group to approach municipal government to deal with the issue that they're dealing with. We do community development, home and abroad. So there are some community psychologists who will work in developing countries. We do consultation and capacity building, again, on and on and on. We do research. We do policy work, right? Because policies impact people very broadly in our country. So community psychologists are everywhere. We're in education, we are in state, federal, provincial agencies, nonprofit agencies. Some people go on to make their own consultation firms. Others are social entrepreneurs. Then we've got my area, academic community psychology, where we teach. So, my friends, that is a very quick run through of Chapter 2, The History of Community Psychology. So just to review some of the key concepts here, we talked about the origins of community psychology, where it came from. It came from World War II, the Civil Rights era, looking at rights for African Americans, women's rights movements, for example. We talked about some of the factors that influenced the development of community psychology, looking at prevention, reforming mental health, using research to impact our initiatives, looking at social change and liberation, the optimism for that social change. We talked about the Swampscott Conference in 1965, very important. We talked about how there were certain groups of folks, mainly from that eugenics and social Darwinist movement, who were blaming individual people for the unfortunate circumstances in which they found themselves. And we have William Ryan, who wrote that very important book in 1971 that challenged that said, that people are not necessarily to blame when they find themselves in these very difficult circumstances. And how can we help people rather than blaming them for their circumstances? A much more humane and compassionate approach to dealing with mental health issues or poverty, for example. So that's a big part of the way we do things in community psychology. We talked about the bottom-up and top-down approaches to dealing with social issues. We talked about the importance of divergent reasoning, and we also talked about what community psychologists do. So, my friends, you have made it through your first week of content in Psych 1105 Community Psychology. Congratulations! You are 1/7 of the way done this course. So stay tuned for your week 2 content, which will be posted at 8 a.m. on Monday. And we are going to do some really great work together in this course. Stay strong. I know you probably have other courses that you're working on, or maybe you have jobs and families and other responsibilities. So just know that you're doing really, really well. You're doing great work. And I'm here for you as well. Even though this is an online class, I'm always very happy to meet with my students anytime. I'm on campus in the A2003 office on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays. You can send me an email. We can talk anytime you'd like. And if you ever have any concerns or questions about the course, I'm here for you. I'm your resource. I want you to be successful in our class. And please use me to my full capacity as your professor. I love my job, and I love working with my students. So you have been officially introduced to community psychology. You are no longer a stranger to community psych. And next week we are going to look at research, why and how we do research in community psychology. Well done. Take a break. Have a good weekend and see you next week. Bye, guys.